Okay, so introduction to Rumi. You're going to see that Rumi is the exact opposite as Maimonides. So those of you who liked Maimonides, you're probably going to struggle with Rumi. And if you had struggles with Maimonides, you're going to love Rumi. They're the exact opposites. So, and of course from different, I mean, same epoch, right? Medieval times, we're going to see that. But of course, Rumi is a Muslim, whereas Maimonides was a Jew. But they also have radically different approaches, right? We saw that it's not the Islam-Judaism thing, because we saw that there was a Muslim scholar who was just like Maimonides, and this was Averroes, right? So this is a difference. You'll see. Yeah, you'll see. Okay, so let me get started with Rumi. Let me give you the outline. I'm going to talk about, first of all, remind you a little bit about the Middle Ages, right? Then we'll talk about Sufism, and then we'll talk about Rumi. Okay. So we are in the same time frame, almost the same time. In fact, when was Rumi born? Anybody remind me, when was Maimonides? Rumi is 1207 to 1273. When was Maimonides? Anybody remember? Actually, I could check. Let's see who gets there first. 1138. Okay. Yes, thank you, Milligram. Okay, so it's around about 100. Okay, so Rumi was born shortly after Maimonides died. Okay, good. So it's around the same time, right? We are in the same, pretty much the same empire, not exactly the same place geographically, but it's the same Muslim empire. We have the same golden age going on. Remember, what did I tell you about the medieval, the Middle Ages in the Muslim Empire in contrast to the Middle Ages in the Christian Empire? What were some differences that I mentioned? Let's review. In other words, how is the Middle Age? How are the Middle Age? I can't speak today. Suresh, go ahead, save me. Yes, Suresh, speak. Okay, Suresh is slow, but Cruz, yes, thank you, Cruz. Suresh, you want to add to what Cruz wrote in the chat?
In regards to what we learned for Islam, they had more tolerance, they had strong medical background and openness to learning.
Okay, thank you, Suraj. Very well done. You really got good notes on that one. Yeah, absolutely, right? In the Christian Middle Ages, we have, a lot of plagues, we have problems. Healthcare is not happening, right? You have a bunch of charlatans roaming through the country. If you saw the movie I told you to watch, which was The Physician, you would see the contrast, right? So in contrast, right, in the Middle Ages, in the Islamic part, you have a lot of hospitals, you have medical doctors, science is progressing, right? Second point, make sure you guys are all remembering this, right? In the Christian Middle Ages, we have a lot more intolerance. This is the beginnings of you have the Crusades, you have the Inquisition, right? There's not much tolerance for people who are thinking outside of, Christianity. Whereas in Islam, you have in general, not always, but in general, the policy is one of tolerance, especially towards the people of the book, right? Christians and Jews. So, and then finally, right, in the Christian Middle Ages, you have a tradition of obscurantism, right? Keeping the masses in a way in the dark, right? You have this in the famous movie, The Name of the Rose, right? If you watch it later, you will see, right, the way that the masses were kept in the dark and only the priests had knowledge, right? In the Muslim Middle Ages, you have, on the contrary, you have a search for knowledge, you have a thirst for knowledge. And remind me, anyone in the class, what is the main contribution in terms of knowledge of Islam for our civilization? What did they do that was their main contribution? What is the debt that we owe them? Yes, Alim, go ahead.
Numbers, I believe.
What? But beyond that, where did they get the numbers? How they got started? How did they get started with the sciences and the math and everything? Who jump started them? What? No one remembers? This is the main point that I made last time. Thank you, Arshad. Okay, right? This was the main contribution of Islam, was to uncover the Greek manuscripts where all of, they had done a lot of progress in terms of astronomy, science, physics, metaphysics, and then they had kind of fallen into oblivion. And we owe the Arabs, right, having unearthed those documents, translated them, and built upon them. So Alim is right, the numbers, right? But it starts, the jump start, right? There was this renaissance or rebirth of Greek culture, which they then built upon, right? So, and then of course, it spread to Europe, and that's where we get our civilization from, right? So I just wanted to review, remember the torn pages of history, right? Let's review. Where, according to your history books in elementary school, where did the Renaissance take place? See if you remember these important points. In Italy, right? And now, according to the teaching I gave you a few weeks ago, where did it really start? Aha. So you were taught Italy was where you had the Renaissance or rebirth, right, of Greek culture, but where did it actually start? Which cities? 3 cities I gave you. Really? You don't remember? I made such a big deal about this. Okay, Cairo is 1. What's the next one? Baghdad, okay. And where Maimonides is from? Suresh?
Morocco.
No.
Cordoba.
Cordova, yes, Spain, right? So very good. Okay, so please remember these last pages of history, right? The true Renaissance, remember, took place in Cairo, Baghdad, Cordova, right? And of course, many other cities, including Fez and Morocco, were part of this, right? But these were the main centers, right? So this is where we are, right? Rumi is part of the same kind of enlightenment, kind of very open, tolerant culture. Sufism, which is the branch of Islam we're going to talk about in a second, you will see how influenced it was, right, by the atmosphere of the times. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, great. Now let's go into Sufism, since we've just gotten there. Okay, so Sufism is a branch, it's a mystical branch of Islam, right? It's an offshoot of Islam. Of course, it's still Muslim, but it places different emphasis, right? It is in a way criticizing aspects of traditional Islam and emphasizing what they believe has been lost in traditional Islam, but it's still there, right? So they base everything that they say on the Quran, but they say these are things that have been forgotten and we want to revive them. So we're going to see that. So the best way to understand Sufism, which was so by the way, Sufism started around the 12th century, right? So much later, right? Islam starts around 500 with Muhammad, and then Sufism emerges much later. And by the way, Sufism is a kind of, has been influenced by several strands. You have, of course, Islam is the main strand of Sufism, but you also have Platonism and Christianity influences, right? Christian influences, Platonic influences, and of course, the core is Islam. So if you read some of the poetry we're going to read, you will sense there strong Platonic influence, right? Some version of Christianity also playing a role, right? You have some concepts in Sufism which seem that they're taken right out of the Christian scriptures, right? So it's very interesting. So Sufism is really a product of these 3 strands, right? Platonism, Islam, Christianity. So let's look a little bit about what it is. What do they believe? Because to really understand Rumi, to be honest, to understand the poetry, which is really cryptic, right? It's not easy to understand the poetry because we'll talk about it in a second, but the poetry is all symbolic. It's all describing deeper spiritual truths. So the best way to really understand the poetry is to understand the spiritual truths that the poetry is trying to teach us. So one way to do that is to study Sufism first, and then you can recognize these elements in the poetry. So that's why I'm going to give you a whole introduction on the basic concepts of Sufism, Sufism 101, so that once you have that worldview in your head, you can read the poetry and you'll understand the metaphors, you'll understand the cryptic language, you'll understand the riddles that Rumi is writing for us, right? Okay, so there are four main distinctions between Islam, traditional Islam, and Sufism. So the first one has to do with the transcendence of God. So this is traditional Islam, right? So I'm going to write it down like this. Traditional Islam, right? Number one, transcendence of God. Okay, so this is the first point of difference between Sufism and traditional Islam, right? In Islam, very clearly, just like Judaism, the transcendence of God is emphasized, right? In other words, God is not among us, right? God is somewhere. He's the creator, he's the judge, he's way beyond our galaxy, right? He's not like us, he's very different. In fact, he's so different that it is, and this difference is so important, that it is actually forbidden in Islam, like Judaism, under pain of death, to actually try to depict God, right? We talked about this when we did Maimonides, right? The issue of idolatry, right? One of the reasons why it's so forbidden, so powerful, right? The command is so strong, right? To not depict God in any form is because this is really the essence of idolatry. What is idolatry? Remind me. In the way we explained it with Maimonides, what does it mean, idolatry? What's so bad about it? See if any of you remember.
Narrow perception of God.
Very good, right? So it's not just that you're building an idol, right? This is not just, of course, it's irritating to see that already, right? But the real problem is that it's a narrow view of God. And you can also, we saw with Maimonides, be guilty of conceptual idolatry, meaning you have a narrow perception or you have a narrow concept of God. So it's not just you're building little idols out of wood and metal or drawing pictures. You can also in your mind be guilty of idolatry. We saw that with Maimonides, right? So any type of depiction of God is forbidden because it brings a narrow view of God, which in a way distorts who God really is. And we saw with Maimonides the problems, right, with that. So this is very typical. Traditional Judaism, traditional Islam both meet on this point, right? We have to protect the transcendence of God. We have to respect it. Okay. Now Sufism is going to flip it. they tend to flip everything. So get used to it. So in Sufism, right, number one, right, with regards to the transcendence of God, they're going to emphasize on the contrary, the proximity of God, right? God is not just far, he's also near. So they're not saying God is not far, right? They agree with that, but they say he is also very near to us. And they have several images to depict that. So one of them is, actually, this is a quote from the Quran that they kind of remind their readers, right? In the Quran, it's written that God is closer to us than the vein that goes through our neck, right? It's a beautiful image. What does this mean? Can anyone explain to me what is that? This is obviously being poetic, right? The Quran tends to be very poetic. It's a work really of literature, right? You have a lot of metaphors and so forth. So what does it mean, the writer of the Quran, when he says, God is closer to us than the vein that runs through our neck? What can be some ways to interpret this image? Let's hear from you. Williams, go ahead.
I'm guessing that since God is closer to our heart and soul than our veins like connected to it was like shown on the outside, but God's with us inside.
Okay, very good, right? So first of all, it emphasizes that God is within, like the vein, right? Also, I like the way you say that it's connected to the heart. So we're going to talk about that. God is actually to be encountered in the heart for the Sufis, not in the mind, like Maimonides, right? Very good. Hark Stark, you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I would assume it means like that God knows us better than like we know ourselves actually, and like he's the one who created us, so like he knows everything about us.
Very nice, right? In as much as God is within, he knows things we don't know. He knows the within of ourselves that we can't see, right? So he knows things about ourselves that I like that. I hadn't thought of it like that, but absolutely, just like the vein is inside and we don't see it, but God is closer to it. He sees what is within that we don't even see about ourselves. Very good. Anybody else want to give it a try? There's a couple more ways to hear this. What happens when you, okay, Respler, go ahead.
I think that also this could be like a little bit of I guess like an interpretation of like the way that we describe like the creation of man in the Bible, in the sense that we say that like man was created like in the image of God, or like with a piece of godliness within them. So I think that also could be a part, like the only way that that God could be closer than something that's already a part of our body is if he is also a part of the body, just like in a closer sense, so that there's a piece of God like within each of us, in our like in each of our makeup, in each of our like DNA, there is a part of godliness in that sense.
Okay, very nice, right? God is within us. And this is a new idea, right? This is an idea, by the way, that you find, of course, in Islam and Judaism, but has been emphasized by Christianity, right? So here you have some elements, perhaps, right, of influence. So yes, God within, right? Also, there's the idea that, you know, if you cut the vein, you die. I mean, I can cut the vein of my finger, it's okay, right? Of my leg. You cut the neck, it's finished, right? So in a way, God is seen as the life force, right? When we cut off contact with God, boom, it's death, right? So, or at least spiritual death, right? According to the Sufis. So, very good, right? So you get an idea, right? A little bit of the mentality. Now, there's another beautiful quote, which I'll come back to. This is in the Sufi tradition, where they say the throne of God, right, which is supposed to be in the heavens, right, actually is found in the heart of the believer, right? So the heart of the believer is the dwelling place of God. It's the throne of God. It's a beautiful image, right, to depict again the fact that God lives within us. He's not just out there in the galaxies ruling the worlds, right, as the creator. He's also dwelling within the human being. It's a powerful idea, right? Okay. So you get the sense. Okay, let's look at point number 2 of difference. So traditional Islam, there's an emphasis on the law, right? So in other words, very important, if you're a Muslim, right, part of what makes you a Muslim is submission to the commands, right, uttered by God in the Quran, right? So there are a number of commandments, a number of things you need to do. And this is what characterizes you as a Muslim versus anything else, right? So let's try and figure out a little bit, just, you know, for curiosity's sake, what are some of these laws, right? Just to get an idea. In fact, they're best summarized in what we call the 5 pillars of Islam. Can anyone tell me what the 5 pillars of Islam are? Okay, yes, Kulova, go ahead.
Praying 5 times a day.
Okay, what else?
Visiting the Hajj.
Pilgrimage. Okay.
Mecca.
What else?
Giving.
Charity, all right. And 2 more.
Fasting.
Yes, good. And the last one, no one ever gets.
Believing.
Yes, believing in the oneness of God, right? So very good. Okay, excellent. So I'm writing this down as she's speaking. Okay, these are the 5 pillars. Let's go over them a little bit just to clarify, and that way you'll get an idea what Islam is. This is Islam 101. So you get to know your neighbors better, especially in Queens. Okay, let's look a little bit at the first thing she mentioned, praying. In Islam, just like Judaism again, right, they're cousin religions. They're very similar. You pray 5 times a day. Why 5 times? Why not just once? Why you got to do it 5 times? Anybody have an idea? Why so many times? Seems like you spend the whole day in prayer. Anybody want to interpret why so many times? So let's see. Yes, Respler, very good. You want to say this out loud, or you're good?
I mean, I don't have to. I think it's like pretty self-explanatory. Like if you make more times in your day to remember God, then he'll be in your mind more times throughout the day, and you'll kind of like make that make that effort, and he'll be brought into everything that you do, because it'll kind of act as a constant reminder.
Okay, absolutely, right. 5 times a day is a way to say all day, right? It's a way to keep yourself attuned to God throughout the day. Because if you just do it in the morning, 2 hours later, you're in the subway, someone just pushed you, God is gone from your heart. I don't know if you have this experience. I do, right? You have a morning meditation, you're all pure and holy, you go outside, you go to the subway or wherever where there's people. And immediately, right, you start to, right, have all kinds of negative emotions, and God is already out the window, right? Whatever God you had accumulated from your practice finished, right? So 5 times a day is a way, it's a rhythm, it's a way to keep connected, right? So that in a way, God becomes part of everything you do. God is not just on Sunday or Saturday or Friday. God is in a way a part of everything that you say, that you do, you're doing it in attunement with God. So that's really the reason, right? Even though it sounds extreme, the idea behind it, which is very profound, is the idea of maintaining a connection with God, of bringing the holy into the profane every minute of the day, right? You want to act with holiness, even though you are in the profane, in the ordinary, right? It's a way to bring the holy into the ordinary over and over again. Very good. Okay, let's look at pilgrimage. So once in a lifetime, right? In a Muslim's life, you want to go and do this pilgrimage all the way to Mecca, right? Where you have this sacred shrine. So why? What's so important about that? What is the meaning of this? What is the spiritual meaning of this pilgrimage? And again, by the way, connections with Judaism, where you have something similar in a festival which is coming up in Judaism, right? The festival of Sukkot. Similar idea, right? If you're familiar, if you live in Queens, you see that every fall you have this Jewish holiday where they build little huts, and they, not huts, they have little kind of little shelters that they build outside of their house, and they're kind of living in a kind of pilgrimage, right? They're kind of enacting the pilgrimage that they did in the desert. So it's very similar. So going back to Islam, what is the meaning of this pilgrimage? What are we supposed to learn from it? By the way, let me give you more details, right? Today, the way they do the pilgrimage is different. You go on a plane, you have first class, then you go to a fancy hotel. This is not how it used to be, right? Used to be you would leave your house with nothing, right? You would just have the clothes on your back, and you would kind of do this long, long journey without really the resources to do this long, long journey. So how would you survive? Anybody have any ideas? How do you survive on such a long journey? There's no airplanes, right? It's on foot or with animals, and you don't have any resources. You just leave the house. What are you going to learn on the way to the pilgrimage? Who's going to help you? Yes, Respler, talk to us. What do you mean?
If you don't have the resources that you need and you still have to go, it kind of reminds you that there's only like one being that can kind of help you in that sense, because if you don't have the means that like you need, I think that it would probably, the intention would be to help people realize that like the only being that can help them is God himself. So
okay, very good, right? You learn to depend on each other, right? The Hajj used to be, this type of pilgrimage used to be that people would, on the path to it, right, you would receive the pilgrims, right, in your home, and the pilgrims knew that people on the way were ready to receive them, right? So it really showed how, in a way, ultimately, right, everything comes from God. We, in a way, we depend completely on God to survive, right? This was teaching them faith, right? So it's not just the destination that mattered. It was the whole pilgrimage itself, where you are kind of dependent on each other. You're dependent on divine providence to survive another day, right? So this is really one of the main significations, I think, of this pilgrimage. Very good. Now, moving on to the third one, which you mentioned, is charity. Okay, so this is similar again as Judaism. Charity is the wrong word, because this is something that you do, it's obvious. You don't do it because you feel like it. You do it because it's normal. So why is that the case, right? Why is it that in Islam as well as Judaism, we are in a way required to give a fraction of our earnings. It's not something you decide. It's not coming out of the generosity of your heart. It's required by law, right? So why is that so important? What is the spiritual value of being required by law, right? Of giving a part of your earnings. Every time you receive your earnings, you give a section to the poor, to the needy. What is the spiritual lesson there? Does anybody know? Milgram, go ahead.
I'm not exactly sure, but I would think that one, just like a value to help those that are less fortunate. And like I know in Judaism that like manifests in other ways, like poor, people who are widows, orphans, things like that. And also it like builds a sense of community. Like if you know that people are depending on you and you're giving to others, it just like creates a stronger community and therefore like a stronger religion and like cohort.
Okay, good, right? This kind of offering is a way to give back to God, right? In a way you receive from God, and this is in gratitude, your way. You can't give back to God literally because he has everything, but you can give back to God in this way. This is a way to show gratitude, right? For what you have received. Very good. Respler, would you like to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking in addition to everything that was said, I also think that it's just a reminder that it all comes from God at the end of the day, meaning like he's the one that provided you with the wealth or whatever you have. And therefore you want to give back to like the other people in your community that you can, because you are like acknowledging that it comes from God, and therefore you want to kind of like share the wealth and like pay it forward in that sense.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Let's see. William, do you have a question?
Yeah, what was the third difference? I didn't get to hear it because it timed out.
We're still in the second.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We're still talking about the law in Islam. Very good. Okay, yes, let me add a little bit to what you both said. This is all very accurate, right? There's a saying in Islam that your money is impure until you give it away. So this is very interesting because it shows in a way that money is like water, right? Imagine a lake where there's no outlet. What happens to the water when it's stuck in one place? Anybody know? Anybody into biology? There's no way for the water to flow. It's just stuck. What happens to that water? I know you're city people. Very good, Leon. Right? It becomes very toxic, right? Because it's stagnant, right? It becomes more and more toxic. So water actually has to flow to remain pure. This is the idea. It's the same with money. If you start to hoard money, actually you develop a kind of toxicity, which is a spiritual toxicity, right? You become selfish, you become self-reliant, you become a hoarder, right? And so Islam suggests, right? Islam is commanding the believer to release, to constantly allow the money to flow. You receive, you give. You receive, you give. You receive, you give. And this actually helps you keep pure spiritually, right? You don't become self-reliant and controlling. And this is what happens, by the way, right? When you start to accumulate money, the more you accumulate, the more controlling, the more anxious, the more, right? And the less generous you become. I mean, it's quite obvious. So this is a way, in a way, to keep yourself pure spiritually, to not allow the money to contaminate you spiritually. And so you are commanded, each time you receive, you give a little, you allow the water to flow, you allow the money to flow, and therefore you protect yourself from spiritual stagnation, spiritual toxicity, right? So that's very profound, right? I think that even as, non-Muslims, it's a good practice to have, right? Or non-Jews, right? Obviously, it's a good practice to have, to tell yourself small percentage needs to flow out for me to stay pure spiritually, not become controlling and selfish and self-reliant, right? And greedy, right? So this in a way keeps you from becoming greedy. When you have to let go every month of a little bit of your money, it wounds the greed, right? And it keeps you healthy spiritually and emotionally. So this is a very, very good practice, right? Liam, would you like to add?
I just have a quick question. So when they're talking about charity and giving back, and you're saying like the law emphasizes that there's a specific amount that's cut from like your income or something. Is it a specific percentage, or is it just give what you can?
So I'm curious, actually. I know in Judaism and Christianity it's a specific percentage, but is there any Muslim in the class can tell me if there is here a specific percentage laid out in the Quran? I'm not sure. Anybody know? Where are my Muslims? Muslim students, make yourselves known. Is there a specific percentage? Yes, Arshad, what is the percentage? Do you know?
I'm not sure about the exact percentage, but it's a very small percentage. I think it's less than, wait.
Are you Googling it?
It's called zakat. That's the actual name for charity. But I think it's less than, it's a 2.5%, yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow. Great. Okay, great. I know in Judaism it's 10% or 25% sometimes. Are you sure it's not 25%?
No, it's a small amount.
Very small. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Very good. I think in Christianity it's 10%. In Judaism it's a variation between 15 and 10% depending on the text, right? So in whatever the amount, right? The idea is to allow the trickle, right? Something has to trickle out for it to not become stagnant. So it could be a very big river trickling out. You can give more or you can give less, but as long as you're giving a little, this is keeping you from becoming toxic. And that's the spiritual value, right? Virtue of this practice. Very good. Okay, let's see. So now going to Sufism, right? This is the second point. So in Sufism, they're going to emphasize something completely different. Versus the law, they're going to emphasize love is what matters, right? So in other words, for them, it's not enough to just practice the law, right? Even if you're giving charity and you're doing the pilgrimage and you're praying 5 times a day, you can still be an unloving person at the end of the day. And we know people like that, right? They're perfect. They keep all the rules, but they're haters, right? So Sufism says, see, it's not enough, right? All of these practices have to, in a way, eventually develop love in your heart. That's the goal, right? The goal of these practices is to make you more loving. If it doesn't make you more loving, you're doing something wrong, right? So they have a story they tell to illustrate this. They say that the law will get you all the way to the doors of the palace of the king. Okay, who's the king? Anybody want to make a wild bet? What is this palace and who is the king they're talking about? God. Very good, right? So the law will get you all the way to the doors, but you need love to step in, right? So in other words, you can keep all the law. If you don't have love, you will remain outside of the palace like the worst pagan over there in the jungle, right? You'll be just the same because you won't be able to enter through the door, right? Ultimately, you need love, right? To penetrate into the presence of the king. So that's the idea. So for them, what really matters is the state of the heart. Once you have reached that state, doesn't matter what you do, right? All of these rules are only there to help you develop love. And if you've arrived, then in a way, the rules don't so much apply to you anymore. So you can be kind of a free spirit at that point, right? This is also an influence of Christianity, right? We have this idea very strongly also in Christianity that love is the ultimate commandment and the rest kind of at that point can fall by the wayside, right? So very similar in Sufism, right? And we'll see again, right, that love is on the level of the heart. We're going to talk about that, right? That in a way, for the Sufis, right, the point of connection to God is the heart, not the mind, right? We're going to talk about this next. So let's look at that. The next point, right, third point in traditional Islam, and this is actually a really good point. I really like this one, even though the Sufis will subvert it, but I'm going to spend a little time on this. This is the rational investigation of scripture. So we talked about it a little bit, but I'm going to go deeper now because this is a really important tenet of especially medieval Islam. This is a practice that was very prominent during medieval Islam and slowly became less, right, prominent in Islam as a whole. But this was really a very important practice. And this was how it worked. This was the idea. First of all, let me emphasize that not anybody could do this. You had to be a scholar to do this. Not any jerk over there, peasant over here, could start doing that, right? So you had to be a scholar, you had to be learned, but you had the duty, according to this principle, to interpret the text when the text started to go against your reason. So they were aware that there were passages in the Quran which would seem not only irrational but cruel, right? So they would go against our common sense or against our humanity, our sense of what is human. And they were aware of that. And they said at that point, when you're reading these passages, which, for example, seem irrational or they seem to incite you to violence, right? They don't seem like humanistic principles, right? At that moment, they say you have a duty to apply your mind and to interpret the text in order to humanize the text. So this is a very powerful practice, right? So in other words, anytime you saw in the text something that goes against either your common sense or your sense of humanity, you had a duty to not take it literally, no, right? You had a duty to interpret, to soften it around the edges, to polish it up, to make it more humanistic, right? So they call this practice ijtihad. This is your one Arabic word of the day. Sorry, I spelled it wrong. Ijtihad. Okay. Anybody know what that word means? It should sound familiar. It's closely related to another word, the only word we know, sadly, in Arabic, coming from Islam. What is this word that we all know that is similar to this word I'm giving you right now? What's the word everyone kept on saying during the Bush era when you were toddlers? Nobody remembers? Jihad, very good, wrestler, right? Jihad means actually struggle, right? Not necessarily war, right? Struggle or war. Ijtihad is from the same root. It means to wrestle or to struggle, right? So ijtihad is the kind of intellectual struggling with the text, right? When the text hurts you, hurts your common sense or hurts your sense of humanity, you have a duty to struggle with the text and arrange things so that the text does not become a problem to your mind or to your humanity, right? So this is very powerful because it's actually a very healthy practice. We saw this, right? We saw already with Maimonides what happens when ignorant people read the text. They take things literally and they go out and kill people, right? We see this in the context of Islam with, for example, ISIS. They're reading the text with ignorant, narrow minds, right? And they're then bringing distorting the meaning and going out, right, and doing these things. So the Muslim scholars were aware of that, and they said, you know, only learned people should do this, should interpret the text. And when they interpret, they have the right to, or when they read the text, they have the right to interpret, right? So this is so powerful, right? This idea that in the name of humanity, I have a duty to interpret. This is important today, by the way, in the way that our country reads, for example, the Bible, right? We have a very toxic debate right now around, for example, the gay marriage or abortion, right? These are issues that are right now very polarizing in our country. And we have the Bible being used to justify, right? Laws against abortion and laws against gay marriage, right? I'm not taking any position. I'm going to remain neutral as I'm saying this, right? But I am wondering sometimes whether the Bible, whether it is healthy to use the Bible in order to oppress, whether it's women or the LGBT community, right? As soon as the Bible becomes a tool of oppression, it is, according to this, being misused. We need, when the Bible is on the, or when any scripture is on the verge of becoming a tool of oppression, we have a duty to interpret and to soften the edges for the sake of the people that these texts are targeting, right? So this is a practice which I think we should follow even today. Now, I'm not saying we should erase the text, right? And act like it's not there. Because if we are to challenge the text is also to challenge us, right? It's a mutual challenge. And the Muslim scholars understood that. Just like the text, the scripture is supposed to challenge me and transform me and take me out of my comfort zone. Me too, I have a duty sometimes to challenge the text in the name of my reason, in the name of my common sense, in the name of my humanity. This was really the freedom, right, that they gave themselves. And you have similar practice in Judaism, by the way. The whole Talmud, which we've talked about already, is all about interpreting, softening the edges, right? Reinterpreting and interpreting again, right? So, and so this is really a very healthy practice, which I think is being taught here in medieval Islam, at least in the context of traditional Islam. So, of course, the Sufis are going to flip it again, right? So this is the part I like about traditional Islam, but the Sufis will go somewhere else completely. So point 3, they're going to say, yeah, rational investigation of scripture, but sometimes we have to accept that religion is irrational. And sometimes we have to take a leap of faith, right? So the Sufis understood, unlike Maimonides, right? For Maimonides, you have to stay rational. You have to stay, your mind is the place. And likewise, traditional Islam, Averroes, everybody, right? Sufis say, no, sometimes the mind will fall behind, right? When it comes to the spiritual journey, there are moments that cannot be explained rationally. There are experiences that cannot be explained rationally, because the spiritual journey is not a scientific journey, right? It's taking us beyond the realm of science, right? You have science where you have reason, which explains everything, but the spiritual journey takes us beyond, and there, in a way, reason becomes incapable of grasping certain aspects of the spiritual journey. And in order to grasp them, we need another organ, which is the heart. Okay, so I'm stopping here briefly because this is going to be the center. So make sure you listen. If you haven't listened so far, make sure you listen now, right? Traditional Islam, the mind is what leads us to understanding the scripture and therefore doing the right thing. In Sufism, they understand that there are moments in the spiritual journey where the mind cannot go any further, right? And at that moment, the heart has to take over. In other words, just like there is a knowledge of the mind, scientific knowledge, for example, is a way to know with the mind. When it comes to the realm of spiritual, to metaphysical realm, the mind is not going to work anymore. You have to change your approach and use an approach of the heart. So let me explain that a little bit, right? This is the idea that there are 2 dimensions, right? One is the dimension of the visible. Everything you see, touch, right, understand. And in this dimension of the visible, the mind is very good at figuring things out, right? This is science. The mind is figuring out, right, how the tree gets its nourishment, figuring out how the body is made, is figuring out the solution for the next plague, right? And this is all in the realm of the visible. So the mind is very good, according to the Sufis, when it comes to the visible realm. But when it comes to the invisible realm, this realm of the spirit, right, the mind doesn't function well anymore. And at that moment, we have to approach this dimension differently with another tool, right, with another organ. And this organ is the heart. And then we can have a different type of knowledge, which is the knowledge of the heart. So you have actually 2 types of knowledge. This is, by the way, your test question. Knowledge of the mind and knowledge of the heart. So this is implying, and this is so interesting, that the heart can know. In the Western society, we know that the mind can know, but we have not yet come to terms with the fact that perhaps also the heart can know, right? There are moments when the mind doesn't know and the heart knows, right? I'll give you a really quick example so you have an idea right now. Suppose you, suppose you're doing like an arranged marriage, okay? So you're on a first date, and in the context of arranged marriage, you have the CV of the person, right? They if I understand it correctly, right? They send some paperwork. So you have the whole CV of the person, right? So you're sitting on your first date, you have the CV, and the CV looks great, right? Person is like, going to be a medical doctor. Suppose you're a woman, right? This is a guy going to be a medical doctor, and their family is wealthy, and they have the same religion, and the recommendation letters tell you how kind and compassionate this person is, and so on paper he looks, and your mind is like, yeah, that's the one, right? You go on the first date, and you're like, yeah, you come home and you're like, I don't know, I don't feel it. That's what you're going to say, right? And your mom's going to be like, what do you mean you don't feel it? What does that mean, right? Knowledge of the heart, right? Sometimes our hearts know things that our minds don't know. There is a whole, and we haven't explored it enough in our civilization, right? We don't take seriously feelings and, hunches. We don't take those seriously. We only take seriously reason. But we are wrong, according to the Sufis, right? Because there's also a type of knowledge of the heart. Now, just like reason, the heart can go wrong, right? We know how the mind can go wrong when it's full of prejudices and when it's narrow, right? You have your mind, if it's narrow and full of prejudices, you're not gonna know anything, right? It's the same with the heart. The heart also can go very wrong if the heart is toxic and full of negative emotions, and we're going to talk about that. So just like we need to purify and expand the mind to know very clearly, we will also need to purify and expand the heart so that we can know more accurately with the heart, right? Because a lot of the times, the heart is so toxic that we can't rely on it, right? It's going to hate someone that's, pretty nice, going to love someone that's a jerk. We know how we fall in love, right? If you're falling in love with someone who's a jerk, it's because your heart needs to be a little bit purified so it can be more discerning. That would be my advice to you, based on Rumi. Okay, so yes, Leon, right? The heart is not quite like the gut instinct, because the gut instinct is also applied to reality. The heart is really the place where you know about metaphysical truth, right? The heart is the place where you can know who God is, whether God exists, right? So it's slightly different from the gut instinct, which is in the gut, right? So it's a knowledge of the heart, okay? Are we clear on this? Let me make sure everyone heard me on this. Put your hand in the screen with the distinction between knowledge of the mind, knowledge of the heart, which we'll go over, of course, in depth, because this is one of your questions, right? So this is where Rumi and Sufism are taking us. We can also rely on the heart to tell us things about reality, especially when it comes to spiritual reality, right? The mind is not that reliable when it comes to the spiritual realm because it's not adapted to it, right? Just like the swan looks great in water and it comes on land and it looks clumsy, that's the mind when it leaves the realm of the visible to enter the realm of the invisible. It doesn't work. It's not adapted to it, right? We need another place. We need to approach things differently with the heart, right? So the Sufis actually believe that the heart could produce reliable knowledge of God, that the mind, of course, can't, right? So you might, this is in a way in a continuation to Maimonides, right? Remember Maimonides said the mind has limitations, we can't really know certain things. And the Sufis agree with that. It's true, we can't know certain things with the mind, but we can know them with the heart. Okay, so the Sufis kind of go one step beyond Maimonides, right? Maimonides acknowledges that, yes, God comes to us through the mind, but when it comes to who God is, right, we can receive divine wisdom, but who God is, we cannot fathom with the mind, right? The Sufis will go one step further and say, yes, but we can fathom with the heart, right? We can know God. And this is quite extraordinary because nowhere in either Islam or Judaism do we have this idea that we can know God, right? We can know what God wants us to do. We can know the right way, but to know God is a different story. The Sufis actually say, yes, it's possible through the heart. We can actually have direct knowledge of God through the heart. So we're going to see how that works next time, of course. Good. Okay, last one, last difference is, so point 4, the notion of now jihad, which we talked about in traditional Islam. Of course, holy war, right? This was, of course, political. In Islam, there was the very realistic idea that you cannot really liberate people spiritually if they're still enslaved politically, right? So the ideal jihad, original way it was supposed to be done, was to free people from the tyrants that kept them from following their souls, right? Following the life of the spirit. So they would take over politically in order to give the space or provide the space for the people to be able to worship in peace, right? This was the highest version of jihad. Not in the way that it ended up being applied, right? Just as brutal conquest. It was meant to be really creating the political conditions for people to be able to worship, right? In peace. So you had sometimes to depose certain rulers who were, you know, tyrants in order to create this space, right? So that was the original intent of jihad. But it was something political, something, the enemy was usually someone outside, an outsider, and so forth. Now, in Sufism, they flip it again, right? You have this notion of internal jihad. In other words, the enemy for the Sufis is not outside, the enemy is within, right? The worst enemy is you. Your negative, toxic emotions, your negative, toxic thoughts, that's the real enemy that we have to fight against and purify ourselves from in order to really reach God, right? So they kind of internalize the jihad in a way that's very interesting. Okay. Now, let's get into Rumi himself. Now that we have a better idea of Sufism, you will be able to decipher the poetry better, but let's talk a few words on Rumi himself. So he was born, like I said, 1207. He is in the region where you have now Afghanistan. That's where he's from, which of course at the time was all merged into the Muslim Empire. So they were living there in a city which still exists called Balkh. But it became dangerous to live there because of the Mongol invasions, right? These were these Asian tribes which were pretty brutal. If you saw the movie Genghis Khan, that's them, right? So they fled, right? They decided to move, and they moved to present-day Turkey in the city of Konya, Turkey. Turkey, is that how you spell Turkey? I'm having a horrible doubt. Turkey with Q? Somebody help me. How do we spell Turkey in this language? Let me try it. Turkey? No.
No, you were right the first time.
Am I? Okay, so it's like a turkey the bird? It's the same thing?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Very well, very well. All right. So he moved to Turkey. And there actually his father actually was a very prominent Muslim scholar. So Rumi wasn't a Sufi yet. He was still young. He was in his early 20s and he was moving with his father. His father was a very famous Muslim scholar in the context of traditional Islam. And as soon as he arrived in Turkey, he starts a university, right? A kind of University of Islamic Studies. And he starts teaching briefly, but then shortly after he dies, right? At that point, Rumi is 24, about your age, right? And he is already well-versed. He has been well-educated. He's ready to take over, right? So he takes over the school and he becomes, for a few years, one of the most prominent, right, Muslim scholars in the context of traditional Islam. He still hasn't met, right? He still hasn't encountered Sufism. So he encounters it in very strange circumstances. And there is like a story, a legend that is told about this encounter. So I'm going to tell you the story, which is also very symbolic, and I'm going to ask you to interpret it. So listen carefully. So the story goes like this. So one day, Rumi is teaching in his house, right? He's surrounded by his students. He's teaching in his library where there are books everywhere, right? It's typical. And all of a sudden, there is a knock on the door. So he goes to the door, and at the door, there's this tiny old man, very frail old man, and seems kind of lost. And so Rumi, right, in typical Middle Eastern hospitality, says, hey, come in, why don't you join us, have a cup of tea, rest a little, and then you can be on your way. So the old man accepts, he comes in, you know, and then they enter the house, they get to the beautiful library that Rumi has, and the old man stops at the entrance, at the threshold, and he looks at all the books, and he's like, what is this? And Rumi's like, you don't know? And all of a sudden the old man goes, shoo, and then fire consumes all the books and they crumble into ash. And now it's Rumi's turn. What is this? He says. And the old man turns to him and says, you don't know? And that's the story. Okay, what does it mean? Who's the old man? What does it mean to burn the books? Why do they both say the same thing? What is this? And you don't know? Can anyone start to give me an interpretation of this story? What is happening in the story? So what does burning of the books signify? Based on what I told you already on Sufism, you should be able to interpret what just happened. Why do the books get burned down? Why does the old man burn the books? Anybody know? Okay, let's see. Williams and then Suresh.
I guess signifying that you won't know God through the books. You need to learn through experience and emotion.
Very good, right? First of all, he's saying you don't need this. And the fire, right, signifies the passion of the heart. All you need, he says, to find God is the fire in your heart. Follow your heart and you will find God. You don't need your mind, right? Very good. That's the first lesson. Suresh, can you add?
To add on, without knowledge, there is nothing more for you to learn, nothing else to believe in.
Wait, what? Say that again.
Without knowledge, there's nothing for you to believe in, nothing to read.
So then what happens? What's left if there's nothing to read? What's Rumi gonna do?
Wonder.
Wonder. Yes, you could say that actually. But the fire represents something, right? What does the fire represent, Suresh? Okay, Wilkes, go ahead. Tell us what you're thinking.
Destruction.
Destruction, yes, definitely, but also something else. Wilkes, enlighten us.
Now that he has no more knowledge, he just has his heart left.
Exactly, right? The fire can also signify the passion, right? The fire in your heart, the love in your heart, right? So he's replacing the books with fire, right? And you're right, Suresh, when you talk about wandering, because fire is the principle of movement in ancient times, right? Fire is the principle of transformation. So what the fire represents is that Rumi has to go through a transformation. He has to begin a journey. He has to set himself in motion away from the old towards something new, right? Same idea, by the way, in Maimonides, right? When Maimonides talks about the moving outside of your comfort zone, we have a similar idea here with Rumi, right? So very good. So that's really the story of the conversion of Rumi, right? He had to leave behind the old and move forward, allow himself to be transformed and allow himself to be guided by his heart rather than by his mind, right? So we'll more on this, of course, as we get into the text. Okay, so just a few words on reading Rumi, right? You'll find that you won't understand anything. I mean, even if it's poetry and it's easy to read, everything has a deeper meaning, right? Rumi is writing. The reason he's writing poetry, right, is to, first of all, because poetry is the language of the heart, right? We saw that Maimonides is writing a philosophical treatise. This is because the mind, right? But because Rumi is talking about a spiritual path which is based on the heart, which is a movement of the heart, is going to write in poetry, right? Which is the language of the heart. But the poetry is still going to dissimulate and keep hidden many of the truths he's trying to say, right? Rumi's not going to write out, this is what you need to believe and do. The poetry is there to awaken our heart to a deeper spiritual experience, right? So it's everything is cryptid, everything is hidden, and in a way it takes a certain passion, a certain perseverance to sit down and decrypt, right? What's being written. And this is on purpose, right? Not everybody has access to this. Only the searchers have access to this, to these truths, right? So that's why the Sufis used to envelop, right, hide the truths that they were trying to teach in the poetic forms and metaphors, so that only those who truly wanted to learn would have the patience to decrypt and try to figure out the poetry, right? So this is a way to not throw the pearls to the swine. So you'll notice, right, that it feels inaccessible. What is he saying? Something profound is going on, but you don't know what it is. Normally, based on the lecture I gave you, you should be able to decrypt some of it, but a lot of it will remain, right, encrypted, right, like we say in the computer language. So don't be discouraged, right? This is normal. Because for the Sufis, you have to really be passionate to be allowed into this level of learning. And so the fact that it's hidden is there to arouse your passion or discourage you if you're not worthy, right? So it's hidden so that the unworthy give up, and so that the worthy become kind of aroused and excited to pursue and to learn more, right? It's a way to filter out the worthy from the unworthy. So if you're worthy, you will persevere and you will try to decrypt, right, what's going on. Because what is really going on, this is metaphysical poetry. right? This is not poetry like the real poetry we have, which is describing what is love and so forth, right? This is a poetry which is supposed to initiate us into very deep and profound metaphysical truths, right? And so that's what it's trying to transmit to us. So it's not poetry about, oh, I feel so in love with you, or, I have this feeling and that feeling, right? This is going deeper. This is metaphysical poetry, which is supposed to contain very profound spiritual truths, right? And only the seekers really get to, because of their patience, to access this knowledge, right? Okay. Any questions on anything I said? Very good. All right, I'll stop the recording.